The Terran medical transport ship Asclepius drifted through the void between star systems, its hull scarred by countless journeys to forgotten worlds. Dr. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the observation deck's reinforced window, watching the massive dreadnought that had been following them for 3 days. The ship belonged to the Draconic Empire, humanity's most powerful galactic neighbor, and its presence made everyone aboard nervous. "They're still there," muttered Captain Torres, joining Sarah at the window. His weathered face showed the strain of the past week. "Been shadowing us since we left the Kepler station. Never seen a dragon ship move so desperate." Sarah nodded, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. Inside were instruments that most of the galaxy considered primitive, human-made devices that relied on organic compounds and traditional chemistry, rather than the advanced quantum healing matrices used by other species. The irony wasn't lost on her that the most technologically backward race in known space was being summoned to treat the heir of the most advanced empire. The communication panel crackled to life, and a deep, resonant voice filled the observation deck. The translator struggled with the complex harmonics of the Draconic language, producing a mechanical approximation of words that should have been sung rather than spoken. "Human vessel, you will follow our guidance to the Imperial Palace immediately. Any deviation from the prescribed course will be considered an act of war against the Draconic Empire." Captain Torres grimaced and activated the response channel. "Acknowledged, Dragon Command. We're following your lead." Sarah had read the briefings during their journey. The dragons were an ancient race, their empire spanning nearly a quarter of the galaxy. They stood 12 feet tall on average, with scales that shifted color based on emotion and social rank. Their technology was so advanced that they had transcended most physical ailments centuries ago, using quantum field manipulation to maintain perfect health and extend their lives for millennia, which made the current situation all the more mysterious. 3 weeks ago, a desperate message had reached Earth through diplomatic channels. Crown Prince Zephyros, heir to the Dragon Emperor, was dying of an unknown illness that had resisted every treatment their advanced medical science could provide. In their desperation, they had reached out to the one species in the galaxy known for their stubborn refusal to abandon primitive healing methods, humanity. The request had shocked the medical community on Earth. Humans were barely tolerated. Members of the Galactic Council, seen as useful for their strange ability to adapt and survive in environments that would kill other species, but hardly respected for their medical knowledge. Most galactic civilizations had moved beyond organic medicine thousands of years ago. Sarah remembered the heated debates in the medical halls of Geneva. Many colleagues had dismissed the request as beneath their dignity, arguing that if the dragon's quantum healing couldn't save their prince, then nothing could. But Sarah had volunteered immediately, driven by a curiosity that had always defined her approach to medicine. Now, as their ship approached the dragon homeworld of Piraxis, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. The planet was a sight to behold, a massive world wreathed in golden clouds, with cities that floated in the atmosphere like jeweled islands. The architecture defied human understanding, with spires that twisted through dimensional space and gardens that bloomed with flowers from a dozen different worlds. It was beautiful and terrifying in its alien majesty. Their ship was guided to a landing platform that jutted out from the main palace complex. As they descended, Sarah could see dragons moving about their daily business, magnificent beings whose scales caught the light of their binary suns and threw it back in dazzling displays of color. She felt very small and very human in comparison. The docking procedure was unlike anything she had experienced. Instead of mechanical clamps and airlocks, the platform seemed to embrace their ship with fields of energy, creating a perfect environmental seal that allowed them to disembark without suits. A delegation of dragons waited for them on the platform. The leader was smaller than the others, which Sarah realized probably meant younger, with scales that shifted between deep purple and silver. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the translator work overtime. "I am Court Physician Nexros," the translation came through. "You are the human healer who claims she can succeed where our greatest minds have failed?" Sarah stepped forward, feeling the weight of skeptical stares from beings who could manipulate matter at the quantum level. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen. I can't promise I'll succeed, but I can promise I'll try everything in my power to help your prince." Nexros's scales flickered to a color the translator couldn't identify. which Sarah took as either amusement or disdain. "Follow me, human. But know that if you fail, if our prince dies while under your care, the consequences will extend far beyond your own life." As they walked through corridors that seemed to bend space itself, Sarah caught glimpses of the Empire's advanced medical facilities. Rooms where diseases were analyzed at the molecular level, chambers where quantum fields rebuilt damaged tissue atom by atom, laboratories where synthetic biologics were crafted with precision that made human genetic engineering look like cave paintings. Yet for all their advancement, something had brought them to seek help from a human doctor carrying a bag of what they would consider medieval tools. The procession stopped at massive doors that rose nearly 30 feet high. Beyond them, Sarah could hear the sound of labored breathing that seemed wrong coming from such a powerful species. Nexros turned to her one final time. "Before we enter, human, you should understand what you are about to see. Crown Prince Zephyros is the heir to an empire that spans 47 star systems. He is beloved by his people, respected by his enemies, and feared by those who would challenge dragon supremacy. 3 months ago, he was the picture of dragon perfection. Scales like molten gold, voice that could shatter crystal, presence that commanded respect across species lines." The doors began to open, revealing a chamber beyond that was dimly lit and filled with the hum of medical equipment. "What you will see now," Nexros continued, his voice heavy with something that might have been grief, "is what remains after our greatest medical minds have exhausted every option known to dragon science." Sarah gripped her medical bag tighter and stepped forward into the unknown, carrying with her the hopes of a dying prince and the weight of 2 civilizations' expectations. The chamber beyond the doors was vast and circular, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. At the center, on a raised platform surrounded by humming medical equipment that defied human understanding, lay Crown Prince Zephyros. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had seen images of healthy dragons before, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of seeing one in such a diminished state. The prince was massive even lying down, easily 15 feet from head to tail, but his once magnificent scales had turned a sickly gray color that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His breathing was labored, each exhale accompanied by a sound like wind through broken glass. Court physician Nexros gestured toward the prince with one clawed hand. "As you can see, the affliction has progressed beyond our initial projections. His scales have lost their chromatic response entirely. His respiratory system functions at 30% efficiency, and his neural pathways show degradation patterns we have never encountered." Sarah approached the platform, her trained eye taking in details that the dragon's advanced sensors might have missed. The prince's breathing wasn't just labored, it was irregular, following no pattern she recognized from human respiratory distress. His scales weren't uniformly gray either. She could see subtle variations in color and texture that might indicate different stages of whatever was affecting him. "What treatments have you already attempted?" she asked, setting down her medical bag and beginning to unpack instruments that looked laughably primitive compared to the quantum medical matrices surrounding the platform. Another dragon physician stepped forward, his scales flickering with what the translator identified as frustrated confusion. "We have reconstructed his cellular matrix 17 times using quantum field manipulation. We have replaced his blood with synthetic alternatives 4 times. We have analyzed every molecule in his body down to the subatomic level and found no pathogens, no genetic anomalies, no quantum fluctuations that could explain his condition." Sarah pulled out a simple stethoscope, its metal surface gleaming under the alien lights. The dragons around her recoiled slightly, as if she had produced a weapon. "Have you listened to his breathing patterns?" "Listened." Nexros's scales shifted to a color the translator couldn't process. "Our sensors can detect variations in respiratory function down to the molecular level. What could primitive acoustic detection possibly reveal that our instruments cannot?" Without answering, Sarah climbed onto the platform. Prince Zephyros was so large that she had to stretch to reach his chest, and when she placed the stethoscope against his scales, she felt the heat radiating from his body. Dragons ran much hotter than humans, she knew, but this felt wrong. Not the steady warmth of a healthy metabolism, but the erratic heat of a system fighting against itself. She listened carefully, moving the stethoscope to different positions across his massive chest, The dragons watched her with what she interpreted as barely concealed disdain, their scales flickering through colors that probably indicated their opinion of her primitive methods. But as she listened, Sarah began to hear something that made her frown. The prince's breathing wasn't just irregular, it was following a pattern, but not a biological one. It sounded almost like communication. "Has anyone considered that he might be trying to tell you something?" she asked, looking up at the assembled dragon physicians. The silence that followed was profound. Finally, Nexros spoke, his voice carrying harmonics that the translator struggled with. "You suggest that the Crown Prince is conscious during these episodes?" "More than conscious," Sarah said, moving the stethoscope to different positions and listening intently. "If I'm interpreting this correctly, his breathing patterns are actually a form of dragon song, aren't they? Very weak, very slow, but structured like language." The dragons exchanged looks that she couldn't interpret, their scales shifting through rapid color changes. Finally, an elderly dragon stepped forward, her scales bearing the deep metallic hues that indicated high rank. "I am Elder Physician Sirathan." The translation came through. "What you suggest is impossible. The Crown Prince has been in a coma-like state for 6 weeks. His brain activity is minimal." Sarah continued listening, mapping the subtle rhythms and patterns in the prince's breathing. "Your instruments measure electrical activity in the brain, right? Neural pathways, synaptic responses, that sort of thing." "Among other things, yes. But dragon communication is more than electrical, isn't it? Your language has harmonic components, emotional resonances that go beyond simple data transmission." Sarah looked up from her stethoscope. What if whatever is affecting him has shut down his normal communication pathways, and he's trying to reach you through the only system still partially functional? Elder Physician Sirathan's scales went through a rapid sequence of colors that the translator couldn't process. She spoke rapidly to the other dragons in their native language, the harmonics creating a complex musical pattern that made Sarah's equipment vibrate sympathetically. "You are suggesting," Nexros said slowly, "that our Crown Prince has been trying to communicate with us for 6 weeks, and we have been treating his attempts as mere symptoms of his illness." Sarah nodded, then had another thought. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small device that looked impossibly primitive compared to the surrounding technology. A simple digital recorder that she used for taking notes. "Can someone here speak dragon song? The actual language, not the translated version?" A younger dragon stepped forward, his scales showing the bright colors of excitement or curiosity. "I am Harmonist Xylos. I am trained in the traditional song speech of our people." "Good. I want you to listen to this and tell me if you can make out any words." Sarah held the recorder near the prince's head, capturing several minutes of his irregular breathing patterns. When she played it back, slowed down and amplified, the result was haunting. The prince's breathing, processed through the simple human device, revealed itself as a weak but unmistakable dragon song. The assembled physicians listened in stunned silence as Harmonist Xylos began to translate. He says, "The shadows move between thoughts. Not illness, not damage, something else. Something that hides in the spaces between quantum and organic. Help me find the bridge back to light." The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the prince's labored breathing, which they now understood was actually a desperate plea for help. Elder Physician Sirathan's scales had gone completely white, a color Sarah had never seen on a dragon before. 6 weeks, she whispered. "For 6 weeks our Crown Prince has been conscious, aware, trying to communicate with us, and we have been treating him as if he were comatose." Sarah packed away her stethoscope and looked around at the assembled dragons. "It sounds like we're not dealing with a conventional illness at all. If he's right about something hiding between quantum and organic, then maybe that's why your advanced treatments haven't worked. You've been looking in the wrong place." Nexros stepped forward, his scales now showing colors that suggested deep thought. "The Crown Prince speaks of shadows that move between thoughts. In our oldest texts, there are references to entities that exist in the spaces between reality, beings that can affect consciousness without touching the physical body. Parasites that feed on awareness itself," added Sirathan. "We thought they were legends, stories told to frighten children." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Well, if they're real, then we need to figure out how to fight something that exists between realities. And maybe, just maybe, that's where human medicine might actually have an advantage." The revelation that Prince Zephyros had been conscious and trying to communicate sent shockwaves through the dragon medical team. Sarah watched as the assembled physicians huddled together, their scales shifting through rapid color patterns that created a dizzying light show in the chamber. Their harmonic conversations were too complex for the translator to process, creating a musical backdrop that was both beautiful and alien. Elder physician Sirathan finally approached Sarah, her ancient scales now bearing colors that suggested deep respect mixed with curiosity. Dr. Chen, your primitive acoustic detection has revealed something our quantum sensors missed entirely. This suggests that these shadow entities operate outside the normal parameters of our understanding. Sarah nodded, pulling out a small notebook and pen, tools that made several dragons step back in what might have been alarm or amazement. If the prince is right about entities that exist between quantum and organic realities, then maybe our primitive approach is actually an advantage. We work in the spaces between your advanced understanding and basic biological function. She began sketching out ideas, her pen moving across paper in a way that seemed to fascinate the dragons. Think about it. Your medicine operates at the quantum level, manipulating matter and energy with incredible precision. But consciousness, awareness, the actual experience of being alive, that's something that might exist in the gaps between quantum and organic. Harmonist Xylos stepped forward, his young scales bright with excitement. In our oldest songs, there are references to the between-dwellers, entities that feed on the life force that connects body and spirit. They were said to be invisible to our greatest seers because they existed in the spaces our minds cannot directly perceive, like shadows cast by lights we can't see, added Nexros, his medical training allowing him to follow Sarah's reasoning. Our instruments can detect the effects but not the cause, because the cause exists in a realm we have evolved beyond sensing. Sarah looked around at the assembled dragons, then at the massive form of Prince Zephyros. Humans haven't evolved beyond anything. We're still essentially the same species that crawled out of caves not that long ago, cosmically speaking. We still think with organic brains, feel with biological nervous systems, and operate on instinct as much as logic. She walked back to the prince and placed her hand on his massive head, feeling the heat and the subtle vibrations of his distress. What if that's exactly what we need here? What if fighting something that exists between realities requires someone who naturally operates between realities? Elder physician Sirathan's scales shifted to deep purple, indicating intense concentration. Explain this concept of operating between realities, Dr. Chen. Sarah sat down on the edge of the platform, her small human form dwarfed by the prince's massive body. Human consciousness is weird compared to most galactic species. We dream for one thing. We naturally slip between waking and sleeping states where our minds process information differently. We use intuition, imagination, and creativity to solve problems that pure logic can't handle. She pulled out another instrument from her bag, a simple pulse monitor that she attached to the prince's neck. We also have this thing called the placebo effect. Sometimes, if a human believes strongly enough that they're being healed, their body actually heals itself, even if the treatment has no physical basis. The dragons exchanged those rapid color flashes again, and Sarah could tell she had said something significant. The mind affecting physical reality without quantum manipulation, Nexros said slowly. We abandoned such concepts millennia ago as superstition. But what if it's not superstition? Sarah asked. What if consciousness has natural abilities that get lost when you become too technologically advanced? What if the shadow entities can be fought using the same spaces between reality that they inhabit? Harmonist Xylos began humming a complex melody, and the translator worked to convert it into words. There are techniques in the oldest dragon traditions, meditation practices that were said to allow consciousness to travel between different layers of reality. They were abandoned when we developed quantum consciousness transfer technology. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Can you teach me these techniques? The silence that followed was profound. Finally, elder physician Sirathan spoke, her voice carrying harmonics that suggested deep uncertainty. Dr. Chen, these are sacred traditions of our people, unchanged for thousands of years. To share them with an outsider, especially a human, is exactly what we need to do if we want to save your prince, Sarah interrupted. Look, I understand the cultural significance, but right now your cultural traditions might be the key to fighting something that your advanced technology can't touch. The dragons went into another huddle. Their harmonic conversation, creating complex musical patterns that made Sarah's instruments vibrate. When they separated, Sirethan's scales had taken on a golden hue that suggested resolution. Very well, Dr. Chen. Harmonist Xylos will teach you the basic techniques of consciousness navigation. But understand, these practices are dangerous even for dragons who have natural mental protections you lack. For a human to attempt them could kill me, could drive me insane, could trap my consciousness in some between realm forever. Sarah finished. Yeah, I figured. But if I'm right about humans being naturally suited for this kind of work, then maybe I have protections you don't expect. She looked down at Prince Zephyros, whose breathing had shifted to a new pattern that Xylos quickly translated as hurry. Please, the shadows grow stronger. Besides, Sarah added, it sounds like we're running out of time for safe options. Harmonist Xylos approached her, his scales showing colors that suggested both admiration and concern. The first technique is called song walking, using harmonic meditation to allow consciousness to perceive multiple layers of reality simultaneously. For dragons, this requires years of training and natural harmonic abilities you do not possess. Sarah pulled out her digital recorder again. Can you sing the basic patterns for me? Maybe I can adapt them to human limitations. What followed was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced. Xylos sang patterns of incredible complexity, harmonics that seemed to resonate not just in the air but in her bones, her brain, her very sense of self. She recorded everything, then played it back, listening for elements she could reproduce with human vocal cords. It's not going to be the same, she said after an hour of practice, but I think I can create something analogous. Human brains are wired differently. We might not be able to achieve your harmonic precision, but we process rhythm and pattern in ways that could work. As she began her first attempt at adapting the song-walking technique, the medical equipment around Prince Zephyros began to register changes. His breathing pattern shifted, becoming more regular, and for the first time in weeks his scales showed the faintest hint of color change. He's responding, breathed Nexros. Whatever you're doing, he's aware of it. Sarah continued her modified version of the ancient dragon meditation, feeling her consciousness begin to shift in ways that were both terrifying and exhilarating. At the edge of her perception, she began to sense something else. Shadows that moved with purpose, hunger, and intelligence. I can feel them, she whispered. The shadow entities. They're here, in the spaces between thoughts, and they're feeding on him. The sensation of encountering the shadow entities was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced in her medical career. As her consciousness extended through the modified song-walking technique, she could perceive Prince Zephyros not just as a physical being, but as a complex pattern of awareness, memory, and life force that extended beyond his massive body. And throughout that pattern, moving like parasites through living tissue, were the shadows. They weren't creatures in any conventional sense. They were more like gaps in reality itself, spaces where consciousness should have been but wasn't, holes in the fabric of awareness that fed on the life force around them. Sarah could feel their hunger, ancient and patient, as they slowly drained the essence of what made Prince Zephyros who he was. They're not just making him sick, she whispered, her voice strained from maintaining the meditation state. They're eating his identity, his memories, his very sense of self. If this continues much longer, even if we save his body, there won't be enough of him left to be called Zephyros. The dragons around her had gone completely silent, their scales shifting to colors that suggested awe and terror. Elder physician Sirethan stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. Can you interact with them? Can you fight them? Sarah tried to focus on one of the shadow entities, attempting to make contact. The moment her consciousness touched it, pain exploded through her mind, not physical pain, but something deeper, a sensation of having something essential torn away from her very being. She gasped and nearly lost her meditative state, but forced herself to maintain contact. The shadow entity recoiled from her touch, and in that moment of recoil, Sarah understood something crucial. They're not used to human consciousness, she said, her voice gaining strength. Dragons think in harmonic patterns, logical progressions, quantum relationships. But human minds are chaotic, unpredictable, full of contradictions and irrationality. We confuse them. Harmonist Xylos began to hum supportively, his song helping to maintain the meditative state. What do you mean, Dr. Chen? Sarah laughed, though she wasn't sure why. I mean that human consciousness is basically cosmic noise as far as these entities are concerned. We think with emotions, we solve problems with intuition. We believe in impossible things and make them work anyway. We're everything a logical mind parasite wouldn't know how to process. She extended her consciousness further, this time approaching the shadow entities not with dragon-like precision, but with purely human stubbornness. Instead of trying to understand them logically, she simply decided they didn't belong there and began to push. The response was immediate and violent. The shadows writhed away from her mental touch, their feeding patterns disrupted by the chaotic energy of human determination. Prince Zephyros's breathing immediately became more regular, and his scales began to show faint hints of their natural golden color. "It's working," breathed Nexros. "His life signs are stabilizing." But Sarah could feel the shadows regrouping, adapting to her presence. They were ancient and intelligent in their own alien way, and they were learning to interpret her chaotic thought patterns. She needed something more than just human stubbornness. "Xylos," she called out, still maintaining her meditation. "Can you teach me the dragon song for healing? Not the words, but the emotional intent behind it?" The young dragon began to sing, his voice carrying harmonics of restoration, renewal, and hope. Sarah listened with her extended consciousness, not trying to replicate the sounds, but absorbing the feelings behind them. Then, she began to fight the shadows with something no dragon could provide: human creativity, powered by dragon wisdom. She imagined herself as a lighthouse, her consciousness projecting beams of pure human chaos in all directions. But instead of random chaos, she directed it with the emotional patterns Xylos had shown her, creating something that was neither fully human nor dragon, but somehow both. The effect on the shadow entities was dramatic. They recoiled not just from her touch, but from her very presence, as if human creativity powered by dragon healing intent was toxic to their existence. One by one, she began to drive them out of Prince Zephyros's consciousness, not destroying them, but making their chosen feeding ground uninhabitable. "The prince," Elder Physician Sarathan announced, her voice filled with wonder. "He's awakening." Sarah could feel it too, Prince Zephyros's consciousness returning to full strength as the shadows fled. His breathing pattern shifted to what she now recognized as grateful dragon song, and his scales began to glow with their natural golden radiance. But even as she celebrated this success, Sarah could sense that the shadow entities weren't destroyed, merely displaced. They were retreating to the edges of perception, waiting for another opportunity. "We've won this battle," she said, slowly returning to normal consciousness. "But not the war. Those things are still out there, and they'll try again." Prince Zephyros's eyes opened for the first time in 6 weeks, revealing depths of intelligence and gratitude that took Sarah's breath away. When he spoke, his voice was weak but unmistakably alive. "Human healer," the translation came through, though Sarah could hear the harmonic beauty of his natural voice underneath. "You have given me back myself. But you are correct. The Between-Dwellers will return, and not just for me. They are spreading throughout the galaxy, feeding on any consciousness advanced enough to attract their attention." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "How many other cases like yours have there been?" Elder Physician Sarathan answered, her scales showing colors of deep concern. 17 that we know of across 6 different species, all beings of high intelligence and social importance, all conditions that resisted conventional treatment." Prince Zephyros struggled to sit up, his massive form still weak but definitely recovering. "The shadow entities are not random parasites. They are targeting leaders, thinkers, those whose loss would create the greatest disruption to galactic civilization. An invasion," Sarah realized. "Not with ships or weapons, but with parasites that attack consciousness itself. And they're choosing their targets strategically." Harmonist Xylos's scales flickered with excitement and fear. If Dr. Chen's techniques can drive them away from Prince Zephyros, perhaps they can be used to help the other victims as well. Sarah stood up, her legs shaky from the extended meditation, but her mind clear and determined. "We'll need to adapt the techniques for different species, train other healers in consciousness navigation, and figure out how to detect these entities before they become entrenched." Prince Zephyros managed a smile that was terrifying and beautiful in its draconic majesty. "Dr. Chen, you have saved not just my life, but potentially the future of galactic civilization. The Dragon Empire will provide whatever resources you need. As Sarah looked around at the assembled dragons, their scales now glowing with colors of hope and determination, she realized that this was just the beginning. Humanity was about to become the galaxy's unexpected defense against an enemy that most species couldn't even perceive. "Well," she said, picking up her primitive medical bag, "I guess we'd better get to work." 3 weeks after saving Prince Zephyros, Sarah found herself in a conference room aboard the Galactic Council's primary station, surrounded by representatives from 17 different species. The room hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert the various forms of communication into something approaching universal understanding. The news she had to share was both encouraging and terrifying. "We've successfully treated 12 of the 17 known cases," Sarah reported, her simple paper notes contrasting sharply with the holographic displays used by other species. "The techniques work, but they require a very specific type of consciousness to implement effectively." High Counselor Vexhai of the Crystalline Ethereal Collective leaned forward, his translucent form shifting through spectrum patterns that indicated intense interest. "Explain this limitation, Dr. Chen. Surely any sufficiently advanced mind could learn these procedures." Sarah had been dreading this question. That's actually the problem. The consciousness navigation techniques work best with minds that are chaotic, unpredictable, and relatively primitive. The more advanced and logical a species' thinking patterns, the less effective they become against the shadow entities. The silence that followed was profound. Around the table, representatives of some of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations struggled to process the implications of what she had just said. Prime mathematician Quellen of the Axiom dynasty, whose species had transcended individual consciousness to become a collective computational matrix, was the first to speak. "You are suggesting that intellectual advancement is a liability in this conflict?" "Not a liability," Sarah corrected. "More like incompatibility. The shadow entities seem to understand and exploit logical, ordered thought patterns. But human consciousness, with all its contradictions and emotional irrationality, confuses them. We're effectively cosmic white noise as far as they're concerned." Ambassador Thoric of the Mechanical Synthesis Union, whose cybernetic enhancements had replaced most of his original biological brain, gestured with one articulated arm. "This creates an obvious strategic problem. The most capable minds in the galaxy are precisely those most vulnerable to this threat, while the least advanced." He paused, diplomatic protocols preventing him from completing the thought. "While humans," Sarah finished with a wry smile, "who barely qualify for galactic civilization status, happen to be naturally immune and capable of fighting them off." Prince Zephyros, who had insisted on attending despite his recent recovery, spoke from his specially constructed platform. "Dr. Chen's assessment is correct, but incomplete. The shadow entities are not merely parasites, they are scouts and advance forces for something larger." The room's attention focused on the Dragon Prince, whose scales had regained their golden luster but still showed faint traces of the gray infection around the edges. "During my experience with the entities, I was able to perceive fragments of their communication patterns. They are preparing the galaxy for invasion by weakening its leadership structure. Each successful infection creates a beacon that attracts more of their kind." High Counselor Vexhai's crystalline form flickered with alarm patterns. "How many more entities are we potentially facing?" Sarah pulled out her tablet, displaying data that had been compiled from her treatments of the infected leaders. "Based on the psychic resonance patterns I've observed, I estimate we're looking at thousands, possibly tens of thousands of these shadow entities already in our galaxy. And they're getting smarter, learning from each encounter." The implications sank in around the table. Commander Zelnara of the militant hegemony forces spoke next, her voice carrying the mechanical precision of her species' neural implants. "If these entities are targeting leadership specifically, then we face a systematic campaign designed to collapse galactic government and military command structures." "Exactly," Sarah confirmed. "And traditional defenses are useless. You can't shoot something that exists between realities, and advanced medical technology can't treat what it can't detect." Ambassador Thoric's cybernetic systems whirred as he processed possibilities. which leaves us dependent on human intervention for both treatment and defense against this threat. Sarah nodded grimly. We've started training programs on Earth, but the consciousness navigation techniques require specific mental attributes that not all humans possess. We're looking at maybe a few thousand potentially effective practitioners worldwide. A few thousand humans to defend a galaxy of trillions, prime mathematician Quellen observed. The mathematical probability of success appears unfavorable. Prince Zephyros shifted on his platform, his massive form radiating determination. Which is why the Dragon Empire has proposed a different approach. Rather than relying solely on human practitioners, we need to develop hybrid techniques that allow other species to work alongside human consciousness navigators. Sarah looked up from her notes, interested despite herself. What kind of hybrid techniques? Consciousness linking, the prince explained. Dragon meditation traditions include methods for temporarily joining multiple minds into a collective awareness. If we could link human chaotic consciousness with the logical precision of other species, we could create a combined force that has both the immunity to shadow entity manipulation and the strategic thinking necessary for large-scale defense. Ambassador Thoric finished, his cybernetic systems clearly running probability calculations. High Counselor Vexhi's form brightened with excitement. The Ethereal Collective has similar linking traditions. Our quantum consciousness networks could potentially interface with both human and dragon awareness patterns. Around the table, other species began suggesting their own contributions. The Axiom dynasty offered computational frameworks for coordinating multiple linked consciousness types. The hegemony forces provided tactical planning algorithms that could function across different mental architectures. But even as the excitement built, Sarah felt a growing sense of unease. "Hold on," she said, raising her hand. "Before we start linking human consciousness to quantum networks and computational matrices, shouldn't we consider what that might do to us?" The enthusiasm around the table dimmed slightly as the implications of her question sank in. Commander Zelnara leaned forward. "Explain your concerns, Dr. Chen." Sarah took a deep breath. "The whole reason humans are effective against these shadow entities is because our consciousness is chaotic and primitive compared to yours. If we start linking with advanced alien minds, upgrading our thought patterns, making our consciousness more logical and ordered, we become vulnerable to the very entities we're trying to fight," Prince Zephyros completed, his scales shifting to colors that suggested deep concern. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. They had found a potential solution to the shadow entity threat, but implementing it might destroy the very advantage that made humans effective defenders in the first place. Prime mathematician Quellen finally spoke, his collective consciousness producing harmonics that the translators rendered as dry amusement. "We appear to have discovered a paradox worthy of our greatest philosophical minds. The only way to save advanced civilization may be to preserve primitive consciousness, but the only way to coordinate an effective defense may be to advance that primitive consciousness beyond its usefulness." Sarah looked around the table at representatives of species that had mastered star travel, quantum physics, and consciousness transfer, all of whom were now dependent on the chaotic, emotional, illogical human mind for survival. "Maybe," she said slowly, "the solution isn't to make humans more like you. Maybe it's to help you remember how to be more like us." The weeks following the Galactic Council meeting transformed Sarah's life in ways she had never imagined. Instead of treating individual patients, she found herself working with entire species to help them rediscover aspects of consciousness they had evolved beyond centuries or millennia ago. The first breakthrough came with the Ethereal Collective. High Counselor Vexhi had volunteered to undergo experimental consciousness regression therapy, temporarily suppressing his species' quantum awareness networks to access more primitive thought patterns. "This is deeply uncomfortable," Vexhi admitted as Sarah guided him through modified human meditation techniques. His crystalline form flickered with unusual patterns as he struggled to think with individual rather than collective consciousness. "I feel isolated, incomplete." "That's normal," Sarah assured him, monitoring his biosigns with equipment that looked absurdly primitive compared to ethereal technology. "Humans feel isolated and incomplete most of the time. We've learned to use those feelings as creative fuel. The breakthrough came when HFY managed to perceive a shadow entity that had been lurking undetected in the station's consciousness networks. His reaction was immediate and violent. Crystalline harmonics that shattered several pieces of equipment and sent him recoiling in terror. It was there, he gasped, his form rapidly shifting between individual and collective awareness states, feeding on our quantum consciousness network, spreading through our shared thoughts like a virus. We never would have detected it using our normal perceptual methods. Sarah helped him stabilize his individual consciousness, then guided him through the process of fighting off the entity, using adapted human techniques. The results were promising but exhausting. HFY's natural efficiency and collective consciousness made the chaotic individualism required for entity combat extremely draining. We can do this, he concluded after the successful engagement, but not for extended periods. My species will need to work in rotation, spending limited time in primitive consciousness states before returning to collective awareness for recovery. Similar experiments with other species yielded comparable results. The Mechanical Synthesis Union discovered they could temporarily downgrade their cybernetic enhancements to access more biological thought patterns. The Axiom dynasty learned to introduce controlled chaos into their computational matrices. The Dragon Empire developed techniques for suppressing their harmonic logic in favor of emotional reasoning. But the most surprising success came from an unexpected source. The young ones adapt faster. Prince Zephyros observed during a training session with juvenile dragons. Their consciousness patterns haven't fully crystallized into adult harmonic logic yet. They can learn to think chaotically without the psychological strain experienced by mature dragons. Sarah watched in fascination as dragon children, their scales still showing the rapid color changes of emotional instability, proved remarkably effective at consciousness navigation. They could perceive shadow entities clearly and fight them off with an enthusiasm that reminded her of human teenagers playing video games. It's the same across all species, she realized, reviewing data from similar training programs. Children and adolescents, beings whose consciousness patterns aren't fully developed yet, can adapt to anti-entity techniques much more easily than adults. This discovery led to the formation of the Galactic Youth Defense Corps, a development that caused considerable controversy among parent species but proved necessary as shadow entity attacks increased in frequency and sophistication. Commander Zelnara was initially opposed to the idea of using children in consciousness combat. These beings are mentally and emotionally immature. Sending them against entities that feed on awareness itself seems irresponsible at best. But they're also our most effective defense, Sarah argued during a heated strategy session. Adult consciousness from advanced species is simply too rigid to adapt to anti-entity techniques. We need minds that are still flexible, still growing, still capable of the kind of chaotic creativity that confuses the shadow entities. The debate was settled when a massive shadow entity attack struck the Axiom dynasty's primary computational world. 17 adult prime mathematicians were infected before the Youth Defense Corps arrived. A team of 12 beings, dragon children, ethereal adolescents, young Synthesis Union members with minimal cybernetic enhancement, and 3 human teenagers, successfully cleared the infestation in 4 hours. The children worked together naturally, Prince Zephyros observed, watching the mixed species team coordinate their consciousness navigation with an efficiency that impressed even military strategists. They haven't learned the species-specific prejudices and limitations that restrict adult cooperation. Sarah nodded, then frowned as new data appeared on her tablet. But we have a bigger problem. The shadow entities are adapting faster than we anticipated. They're learning to interpret chaotic consciousness patterns, developing new feeding strategies. The evidence was undeniable. Recent entity encounters showed progressively more sophisticated behavior. Shadows that could mimic chaotic thought patterns to avoid detection. Entities that could resist displacement techniques, and most disturbing of all, shadows that seemed to be communicating with each other across vast distances. They're sharing information, High Counselor HFY concluded during an emergency council session. Each encounter teaches them more about our defensive capabilities. At current adaptation rates, our advantages will be neutralized within months. Sarah stared at the data, her mind racing through possibilities. Then we need to stop playing defense and start taking the fight to them. But to do that, we need to find out where they're coming from. Prince Zephyros's scales shifted to colors indicating deep concern. Dr. Chen, consciousness navigation techniques allow perception across different reality layers, but they weren't designed for interdimensional travel. Attempting to follow the shadow entities to their origin point could kill everyone who tries it, trap their consciousness in between space forever or worse. Sarah finished. Yeah, I know. But do we have a choice? Around the council table, representatives of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations contemplated the prospect of sending their children into an unknown dimension to fight entities that fed on consciousness itself, guided by techniques developed by the galaxy's most primitive species. Commander Zelnara was the first to speak. If we proceed with this plan, we need to consider the possibility that it's exactly what the shadow entities want. They may be adapting to our techniques not to defend themselves, but to learn enough about our consciousness patterns to guide us into a trap. Or, Sarah said quietly, they're adapting because they're afraid. Maybe our chaotic consciousness isn't just immune to their feeding. Maybe it's actually toxic to them in large enough doses. The idea hung in the air like a challenge. If humans and other chaotic consciousness types weren't just immune to the shadow entities, but actually poisonous to them, then a coordinated assault into their home dimension might be possible. But it would require risking everything on the premise that human consciousness, chaotic, emotional and illogical, was not just different from advanced galactic thinking, but superior in this one crucial aspect. There's only one way to find out, Sarah said, looking around the table, and we'd better decide quickly because the next wave of attacks is going to be bigger than anything we've faced so far. The final confrontation began not with grand military preparations, but with Sarah sitting in a simple meditation chamber aboard the Galactic Council station, surrounded by 12 young beings from 7 different species. The Youth Defense Corps had volunteered for what everyone knew might be a one-way journey into the shadow entity's home dimension. Remember, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. We're not trying to destroy them. We're trying to understand them, communicate with them, and if possible, negotiate. Kixtha, a young dragon whose scales still showed the rapid color shifts of adolescence, tilted her massive head. And if they refuse to negotiate? Sarah smiled grimly. Then we show them what happens when chaotic human consciousness gets really angry. The meditation chamber had been specially configured with equipment from multiple species: dragon harmonic resonators, ethereal quantum consciousness amplifiers, synthesis union neural interface networks, and human biofeedback monitors that looked primitive by comparison, but had proven essential for tracking consciousness navigation progress. Prince Zephyros's voice came through the communication system, his concern evident even through the translation filters. Dr. Chen, are you certain about this approach? The shadow entities have shown increasing sophistication in their attacks. This could be walking into a trap designed specifically for our defense teams. It could be, Sarah agreed, but the alternative is waiting for them to adapt completely to our techniques, and then face an invasion we can't stop. At least this way we're taking the initiative. High Counselor Vex High, speaking from the Ethereal Collective's monitoring station, added his own concerns. The dimensional bridging technique you've developed is untested beyond brief reconnaissance missions. Sustained consciousness projection into the between realm could result in permanent displacement. Sarah looked around at the young faces and the alien equivalents of faces surrounding her. Each of these beings had volunteered knowing the risks, driven by the kind of idealistic courage that adults too often dismissed as naivety. Sometimes, she said, naivety is exactly what you need to attempt the impossible. The consciousness navigation began with familiar techniques, the modified song walking that had first allowed her to perceive the shadow entities, adapted now for group consciousness projection. But instead of simply extending their awareness into the spaces between realities, they were going to try something unprecedented, following the shadow entities back to their source. As their combined consciousness expanded, Sarah felt the familiar sensation of perceiving multiple layers of reality simultaneously. The physical chamber around them faded, replaced by the strange non-space where shadows moved with purpose and hunger. But this time, instead of individual entities feeding on isolated victims, they could see the larger pattern. They're connected, whispered Jex, a young synthesis union member, whose cybernetic enhancements had been temporarily downgraded. All of them, linked together like nodes in a network. Sarah pushed their group consciousness further, following the connection threads between shadow entities. What they found was both terrifying and heartbreaking. The shadow entities weren't invaders. They were refugees. Their home dimension is dying, Sarah realized, her consciousness touching the vast network of entity communication. They're not feeding on our awareness out of malice. They're feeding because their own reality is collapsing. And our consciousness is the only thing keeping them alive. The revelation changed everything. Through the group consciousness link, the young defenders could perceive the shadow entity's true nature. Beings of pure awareness whose native dimension was succumbing to entropy, leaving them no choice but to flee into neighboring realities and sustain themselves on the consciousness of other species. But the process of feeding was slowly poisoning them, making them more desperate and aggressive with each encounter. They were dying even as they tried to survive, and their feeding was causing the very conflicts that made their situation worse. Kixta's youthful dragon consciousness reached out toward the nearest shadow entity, not with the intention of driving it away, but with curiosity and compassion. The entity recoiled initially, then slowly approached, its hunger tempered by confusion at this new type of contact. They've never encountered consciousness that wanted to understand them rather than fight them, the young dragon observed. Their experience with galactic species has been entirely defensive. Through the group consciousness link, Sarah began to formulate a plan that was either brilliant or completely insane. What if we don't fight them? What if we help them? The idea was audacious beyond anything attempted before in galactic history. Instead of driving the shadow entities away, they would create a symbiotic relationship, offering sustainable consciousness resources in exchange for the entity's departure from unwilling hosts. Human consciousness regenerates differently than other species, Sarah explained to the shadow entity network through their consciousness link. We're used to chaos, confusion, and having our awareness fragmented. We might be able to provide what you need without being harmed in the process. The response from the shadow entities was immediate and overwhelming. Hope mixed with desperation, ancient hunger tempered by the first possibility of sustainable survival they had encountered since their dimension began dying. But the solution required something unprecedented: voluntary consciousness sharing between humans and interdimensional entities, mediated by the adaptive capabilities of other galactic species. We'll need volunteers, Sarah announced as their group consciousness returned to normal reality. Humans willing to enter into permanent consciousness partnerships with shadow entities, providing them with sustainable access to chaotic awareness while gaining enhanced perception abilities in return. The proposal, when presented to the Galactic Council, created the largest political upheaval in recorded galactic history. Some species saw it as humanity's final proof of their primitive irrationality. Others recognized it as the most innovative solution to an impossible problem. Prince Zephyros was among the strongest supporters. Dr. Chen has demonstrated that human consciousness operates on principles that consistently confound our expectations. If they believe this partnership is viable, then we should provide whatever support they require. 6 months later, the first generation of human entity partnerships was operational. Humans who had volunteered for the program reported enhanced intuitive abilities, expanded awareness, and the ability to perceive threats that purely organic consciousness couldn't detect. In return, their shadow entity partners gained sustainable access to chaotic consciousness that met their survival needs without the aggressive feeding that had characterized their previous behavior. The success of the program led to similar initiatives with other species, creating a new form of galactic cooperation based on consciousness diversity rather than technological advancement. Sarah, now serving as Director of Interdimensional Consciousness Relations, often reflected on the irony of the situation. Humanity's supposed primitiveness had not only saved galactic civilization but had opened up entirely new frontiers of consciousness exploration and interspecies cooperation. It turns out, she would tell new classes of consciousness navigators, that being the least advanced species in the galaxy was exactly the qualification we needed to advance everyone beyond what they thought was possible. The shadow entity crisis had taught the galaxy a fundamental lesson. Sometimes the most important solutions come not from the most sophisticated minds, but from the most adaptable ones. And in a universe full of advanced civilizations, it took humanity's chaotic, emotional, wonderfully illogical consciousness to prove that wisdom and advancement weren't always the same thing. Prince Zephyros, fully recovered and now bearing scales that showed faint traces of interdimensional perception patterns, summarized the transformation in a way that became famous throughout galactic space. We thought we needed to cure the Dragon Heir of his affliction. Instead, Dr. Chen taught us that the galaxy itself was afflicted with an excess of advancement, and the cure was learning to be primitive again.